Without more ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker for this evening, Rima Basu from Claremont McKenna College in California. Rima did her undergraduate and master's at the University of Toronto before getting a PhD from the University of Southern California. I saw to my amazement that she's a 2018 PhD. You wouldn't think so from looking at the quantity of stuff that she's published. She writes about questions including the ethics of belief, you might say, but not in the sense that some philosophers have used that term. When do moral as well as epistemic considerations bear upon what we ought to believe? When can you be morally blamed for believing something? And when should moral factors as well as epistemic factors be allowed into the formation of belief? But this evening, she's going to talk to us about the importance of forgetting. Rima, over to you.
Thank you so much. I certainly have the grey hair to show for the publication since 2018. It's been a very stressful time, but things have gotten much better. So thank you all for coming. I'm amazed at this sort of turnout to a philosophy event on a Thursday night, and I hope I can make it worth it. I know because you'll be thinking about this throughout the talk, I'll just address it up front. The accent is a mix of Australia and England, because I spent some of my youth across those two places, but I was born in Kentucky, and so I'm actually an American-Canadian citizen, but I have this accent. And so now that that is set aside, we can actually get into the content of today's lecture. So generally, when we forget something, we feel bad that we've done so. We either feel that it was something that we should be able to remember, like where you left your car keys, or we feel bad that we've let someone down by forgetting something important, like you had promised a friend to call them back after lunch, but then you got swept up in work and you completely forgot to do so. And so realizing that we forgot something is often marked with this feeling of loss, with whatever that we had forgot is kind of mourned in a way. Like forgetting is something that we're told we should avoid doing. I'm sure that everyone here is familiar with this really famous quote from George Santayana, that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Like when atrocities happen, we're told we must never forget. And we understand why it's so important to remember those things, because to forget would feel like a further insult to the people who are harmed by those sorts of atrocities. And so I don't want to today downplay the importance of memory and forgetting, because it is far too easy to look away from the things that we've done. What I want to make the case for today is that forgetting is also really important. To make the case that forgetting can be good, that forgetting need not always be met with this feeling of loss. And now with many things, I'm not the first to note this. So in fiction, a really sort of famous short story is one by Ted Chiang. The short story is called The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling, which appears in this short story collection. And that story explores sort of how difficult forgiveness becomes in a potential future where we have recording devices that track every intimate moment of our lives. I know, crazy thought. Well, that will shortly not happen. There's no longer any doubt in this future about who really won an argument when a recording can be called up at a moment's notice. And as the short story tries to bring out, too much remembering can be detrimental to our lives. And of course, it's not just in fiction where we see the importance of forgetting. So many philosophers, psychologists, neuroscience have been noticing that forgetting plays really important roles in our lives. And my talk today is an attempt to survey some of those important roles. In particular, here are the key claims that I want to sort of present today. What I'm going to make the case for is that forgetting is an integral part of our moral duties to other people. Some aspects of our identity are meant to be forgotten. So there's this activity that we engage in, one that I'm going to be calling the practice of identity shaping and construction, and this activity depends on our ability to grow and change over time, and a barrier to that growth and change is a failure to recognize the ways in which we may no longer be those same people that we were in the past. And so what I'm going to be arguing is that there's this distinctive harm that accompanies the permanence of some content about us. Content that impinges upon that identity-shaping practice that ends up prompting this moral duty to forget. And so here's a map of how I'm going to make this case. So I'm going to start with an account of this practice of identity shaping and the role we all play in each other's understandings of themselves. Then I'm going to talk about the specifics of forgetting and distinguish 3 forms that it can take. Then I'm going to turn to how we practice these forms of forgetting in our everyday lives and the goods that these practices facilitate. For example, actually I'll just skip the examples and you'll just sort of hear them when they come up. And then I'm going to turn to some new threats to forgetting. I turn to how the account developed up to that point, so what I've done, hopefully by then in 1, 2, and 3, how that can show us some additional sources of harm sort of caused by big data and technology. Because as we're all familiar, the internet never forgets. And so the sort of ease of access to private information and the permanence of that information, plus the incentive structures that push companies towards collecting more and more information and preserving it forever on the internet, threatens the goods that I will have outlined in part 3. And finally, I'll of course end by considering some potential worries for this important role for forgetting that I've been trying to outline. Okay, so into the details. So when I say that there's this sort of practice of identity shaping, what I have in mind, what I'm sort of drawing on explicitly, is Hilda Lindemann's account of personal identity, where she argues that personhood is this socially shared practice that involves 2 aspects, holding and letting go. On Lindemann's view, our identities are these sorts of narratively constructed things that are composed by the kinds of stories that we and the people around us tell about who we are. And so on Lindemann's view, the answer to the question, who am I, is constituted by the stories that we and others tell about ourselves, and this practice of holding someone in their identity involves this kind of storytelling. And so holding, when it's done well, supports an individual in the creation and maintenance of a personal identity that allows her to flourish personally and in her interactions with others. When it's done badly, it can be destructive. And so as I've argued as sort of across my work, and as Edward kindly said in his introduction, I've been arguing that we have this kind of like moral obligation to hold each other well. And this extends beyond just like our actions towards people or what we say to them, but also how we hold them in our minds, like how we think about them as well. And so given the importance of how others think about us in their inner thoughts, I think there's this obligation to perform this holding well. And then this identity work that's at the center of our interpersonal relationships involves not only like believing things about our loved ones, but also forgetting certain things about them. So in contrast to like holding, there's then letting go. And so according to Lindemann, letting go is this process of weeding out the stories that no longer fit and constructing new ones that do. And this, of course, can be done well or it can be done badly. So as like a sort of personal example, if my parents continued to think about me in line with the stories that they had constructed of who I'd be like before I came out to them, I don't know if the haircut was any indication, but yes, they can wrong me because their stories like no longer accurately reflect who I am. Like, yes, it's true, I like dated a boy in kindergarten, but that was kindergarten. Like, I'm not that person anymore. It's a story that doesn't fit. It's a story that should be let go. It's in the past. It should be forgotten. And so we ought to let go of stories about people when those stories like no longer fit who they are. And it's here at letting go that we get this like moral duty to forget. So we ought to let go. And so, we ought to let go about these stories that no longer fit. And so forgetting plays this like really important role in this kind of like mutual recognition that's central to our relationships with one another. And so returning to our roadmap, that's number 1 done. And so to now like better understand forgetting and what kind of duty we might have to forget, I'm going to do the sort of like classic philosophy thing and give a taxonomy of forgetting. And so thinking about different forms that forgetting can take. And so with respect to the small stuff, we tend to think our memory functions to track importance. Like it's not only harder to forget a friend's birthday, it's also way worse when we do because how important our friends are to us. When a student like forgets a meeting that they had scheduled with me, it hurts a little. Like, one, I'm happy I have free time, but I'm also sad because it means I'm not important to them. And of course, that doesn't hurt nearly as much as when my parents forgot to pick me up from school. And so let me present an example from one of my favorite television shows, Grace and Frankie. So in this show, one of the characters, Robert, remarks to his husband when he's questioned about his recent bouts of forgetfulness. Robert says, I'm going to let you into a little secret about my brain. I have an important file and an unimportant file. And the latter is where things go that aren't important to me in the moment. Now, unfortunately, as is revealed later, Robert's memory is in fact deteriorating, and his husband was right to be concerned. But generally speaking, a low-stakes meeting for coffee or the answer to the question of what you ate the previous day just aren't the kinds of thing that tend to be important to us and are thus much easier to forget than the stuff that is important to us. And another sort of interesting aspect of forgetting is that often it makes sense to say that you forgot a thing when you still have the ability to recall it. And so, as this famous meme sort of demonstrates, you're watching something and you recognize that actor from something, but you can't remember what it was, and you're just I guess I don't remember who they are. But then later in the day or several weeks later, you're doing dishes or something, the name just comes to you. That's a way that we talk about forgetting, even though you haven't really forgotten, because it's you were still able to recall it later. And so when you've forgotten in this way, what we've really done is archived that name. And so when we think back to Robert's process of sorting information into one of two files, there's the important box and the not important box. And this classification system that he's using functions as a kind of forgetting. Because when you place something in the unimportant file, it can still be recalled, but not as easily or quickly as the stuff that's placed in the important file. As items fade away in the background or are archived, they sort of function as forgotten. And so we're going to call this kind of forgetting archival forgetting. And so what these sorts of sorting choices that we make reflect our values and our moral judgments of what's important and what's not. And as such, these choices can be subject to legitimate complaints from others. When we forget something that we shouldn't have, because of these choices that we've made about what's important and what's not important, we can be held morally accountable for that choice. And so that's archival forgetting. And then there's some other kinds of forgetting that we can sort of see from considering some other pop culture examples. So here's a quote from the opening chapter of Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend. So one of the main characters, Elena Greco, has just discovered that her friend has sort of disappeared. And so she writes, "It's been 3 decades since she told me she wanted to disappear without leaving a trace, and I'm the only one who knows what that means. She never had in mind any sort of flight, a change in identity, the dream of making a new life somewhere else. And she never thought of suicide, repulsed by the idea that Rena would have anything to do with her body and be forced to attend to the details. She meant something different. She wanted to vanish. She wanted every one of her cells to disappear, nothing of her ever to be found." And so we see Elena Greco discovering her childhood friend Leela has vanished. All of Leela's possessions are gone. She's cut herself out of every picture. There's no evidence left behind that would suggest that Leela used to live in that apartment. But as much as Leela might try to disappear, as much of her past life she might try to destroy, there is evidence that she can't destroy. Elena remembers her, and sort of driven by her anger at Leela's disappearance, Elena sort of sets out to deny Leela her wish to disappear. She begins writing about her friend. Elena will preserve Leela's story. And so this desire to have people forget us may not be familiar to everyone, but it brings out the sort of messiness that's involved in this holding and this letting go. Because Leela wants to be forgotten. She wants to be let go, but Elena refuses to give up her best friend. And unlike forgetting stories about the past that no longer fit the people we are, Leela seems to go too far in asking Elena to forget her entire existence. That's not really a demand she can make of her. But it is the case that we do often remove people from our lives in an effort to move forward. We try to forget them because our memories of them can sort of keep us anchored in the past. And so as another example, consider Charlie Kaufman's 2004 film, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. So in this movie, one of the characters, Clementine, she wants to erase all memories of an ex, Joel. As she says here, "My name is Clementine Krasinski. I'm here to erase Joel Barish. He's boring. Is that enough reason to erase someone?" And so unlike Leela, Clementine succeeds in erasing Joel. And the reason is twofold. So first, technology exists in Clementine's world to remove the memories that we have of others. And second, she only wishes to remove her memories of Joel, not for Joel to forget her. But even Clementine's case, and I guess a spoiler for the movie, but it came out 20 years ago, even her case is complicated because the memories that she has erased are still recorded on tape. And so both cases share an important similarity. In both cases, we see a desire for no trace forgetting, a total erasure of the memories of another person. But in both cases, we also see that desire thwarted. In Leela's case, it's because Elena still has these memories of her. In Clementine's case, and this is the spoiler, it's because the company that erased her memories preserved a recording of her memories, and that copy is mailed to her in the closing act of the film. And so this no trace desiring that they both desire is likely impossible, and perhaps the closest we can get to it in our actual world is this sort of practice that's called damnatio memoriae, which is like a form of punishment where all record of a person's existence is erased from history. But notice that even for this form of punishment to be enacted, someone has to remember. Like, you can't direct the destruction of information without knowing what it is that you're looking for. And even this kind of forgetting is like a process. And it's an active process, unlike the passive process that occurs when you place something in your unimportant file. And again, to like complicate things even more, the absences record a kind of archive. Like, historians will study those absences to see who was that, who fits in where there should be someone in that picture. But it's also, again, worth noting, if there has been a successful trace of no trace forgetting, none of us would know that. So, another way that we can sort of shed light on the nature of forgetting and when it can be morally evaluated for how we structure our forgetting is by looking at how different organizational structures facilitate different kinds of forgetting. And so as Boker and Starr note in their 2000 book, Sorting Things Out, there are several positive cases of forgetting. And the cases they outline are when rediscovery is easier than remembering, and when forgetting facilitates a change in identity. And so in the first form, they use the example of how airline companies usually don't retain a record of one's like food or seating options because the cost of constructing archives for such like precise and large amounts of data are too high for the payoff, and so it's easier like to just process passengers anew each time. And then for the second form, that's when forgetting facilitates a change in identity, they note that when an organization wants to change its identity, the argument that we've always done things this way stands in the way of breaking new ground. And this is the kind of forgetting that seems really central to our practice of holding and letting go. And so to get more specific, they make this distinction between clearance forgetting and erasure forgetting. And so clearance forgetting is the erection of a barrier in the past at a certain point so that no information or knowledge can leak through to the present. And then erasure forgetting is this ongoing destruction of selective traces in the present. And so erasure forgetting kind of seems like that damnatio memoriae and our discussion of no trace forgetting. Clearance forgetting, however, suggests a third category of forgetting, one that's distinct from both like no trace and archival forgetting. So clearance forgetting would kind of be like if Robert from Grace and Frankie had this third folder, in addition to the important and not important folders. This is a folder for undesirables, we might call it. It's a folder for the memories that he wants to quarantine from other memories that he doesn't want to play any role in his inferences. Now, of course, the metaphor of a folder is a bit too weak for the degree to which he wants to like isolate these memories. Like, these are memories around which he's built walls. Like, perhaps the memory is just too painful. Perhaps other people have asked him to like silo that memory off from the rest of his mind. And so running with that imagery of like siloing it, we're just going to call this form of forgetting siloing. And so we can get at least 3 forms of morally evaluable forgetting. There's erasure or no trace forgetting, there's archiving or archival forgetting, and there's siloing or siloed forgetting. And so now that we have some clarity on, hopefully some clarity, on how forgetting could be morally evaluable in the forms that it can take, I'm now going to turn to this question of like, or sort of explicates why forgetting can seem desirable. And so I'm going to run through 3 examples that sort of show important like moral practices that we have in place that are sort of motivated by recognizing that there does seem to be something really important to forgetting, that forgetting helps to protect or facilitate. And so then the first example is juvenile arrest records. And so here's something that I used to think. I'd be surprised if there's not at least one person here who also thinks the same. I thought that it was the case that juvenile arrest records were private and that they were expunged when someone turns 18. And so here I'm talking about the US context because it's the case that I'm most familiar with. Now, it turns out this idea that juvenile arrest records are private or get expunged is actually a really common myth, but it wasn't always a myth. And so those of us who thought that, we had reason to think it. And so as Joy Radis notes in her sort of overview of the juvenile record myth, the common misconception that juvenile arrest records are not public stems from the origins of the system itself. As she writes, juvenile courts were the first courts to expunge or destroy records, relying on the premise that juveniles should be able to outgrow their youthful indiscretion and be given a clean slate in adulthood. And so a key factor in the origins of the juvenile courts, of this idea of a separate juvenile court system in which records would be erased, the key idea there was to save the child from the brand of criminality, a brand that sticks to it for life. And so as the Supreme Court of Arizona wrote in 1965, the policy of juvenile law is to hide youthful errors from the full gaze of the public and bury them in the graveyard of the forgotten past. And so with this sort of background, we can see in the origins of the juvenile court system, there's this really valuable good that a kind of no trace forgetting is seeking to facilitate. So this forgetting facilitates a change in identity. The forgetting ensures that one's future isn't improperly constrained by the past. And now, as with many valuable goods, this sort of fresh start enabled by no trace forgetting has been undermined by racism. So again, talking about the United States, sort of faced with this sort of public panic over rising crime rates, juvenile record protections were eroded over the course of the 80s and the 90s in the interest of protecting the public from this new class of criminals, so-called super predators. And so although this idea of super predators has been debunked as a racist myth, this sort of demonization of Black youth has been undermined by the goods that the juvenile justice system sought to facilitate through the expunging of records when juveniles became adults. And so fear of this new class of criminals precipitated an urge to record more. And so this is something quite familiar. Fear of something sort of forces us towards more surveillance, more writing things down, harder to erase once past. After all, we have to protect society from these super predators. And so it's now the case that juvenile arrest records contain more information than ever before. They include photographs, fingerprints, often also DNA, and that information is shared even more widely. And so, for example, that information is often shared with the juvenile school, which could then result in suspension or expulsion, and then you get a permanent record. The information is often also shared with social services, and if the juvenile lives in public housing, they could be evicted, and now that eviction notice is, again, a permanent record. And even if they're lucky to live in a state that still practices the expungement of juvenile arrest records, the record can still exist in some form across a range of different agencies, each with their own policies about how that record will be handled. And what they do with those records can then, in the case of expulsion or eviction, can be harder to erase from someone's history. And also the sort of dispersal of the information across all these different agencies also increases the risk that that private information could become public, for a record to follow one even when it shouldn't, for that silo to leak. Because not even Clementine could achieve no trace forgetting because a recording of her memory was preserved. And so how can anything be buried in the graveyard of the forgotten past if records still exist? And so we see here that there was a system in place motivated by the recognition that forgetting can enable people to shape their identities in positive ways if their youthful dalliances have a chance of being forgotten. But this good has been undermined, and people are more constrained by their past than ever before. And so, of course, youthful dalliances is doing a lot of work there for the kinds of crimes that we think sort of should be forgotten. And so then on to the second example. So another example of the importance of forgetting is forgiveness. So when someone asks you to forgive them, they too seek an expungement of the past. forgetting helps facilitate this process of forgiveness, because central to forgiveness is this idiom that to forgive is to forget. And like with most sayings, it of course obscures a bunch of nuances. For example, it's like just as common to hear, one should forgive but not forget. Again, as is the case in like truly atrocious crimes where the forgetting of what happened would be like another insult to the victim. But forgiveness quite generally does seem to require something on the part of the forgiver, some act of wiping the slate clean, of not like holding on to those past misdeeds, but sort of like expunging the past from their records. Like if someone has forgiven you for some wrongdoing that you did in the past, we'd think it'd be unjust if they like continued to bring up that wrongdoing when they claim to have forgiven you for this. And so this suggests that once forgiven, that misdeed has to kind of be like archived or siloed away. And so forgiving is a process that helps facilitate forgetting. And so, for example, consider Rima Basu. So Rima has hypothymesia, also known as superior autobiographical memory. He remembers everything. And he reports that forgiving is a lot harder for him because he can never forget what was done. As he says, since forgetting is not really a luxury that I have to genuinely learn to forgive. Since forgiving and forgetting isn't something that it isn't really the easiest thing for me. And for more on this, we can return to that Ted Chiang short story, The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling, because that short story is a rich resource for exploring the many themes. It explores many themes from the effects of writing down history to the effect of technology on our private lives. I highly recommend it to anyone who hasn't read it. But today I want to sort of focus on how the story explains the importance of forgetting for forgiveness. So in this story, there exists this technology called LifeLogs. And so LifeLog is a wearable personal camera that captures continuous video of a person's entire life. And so I made this slide before Zuckerberg announced Facebook's new wearable glasses. And so as noted in the story, LifeLogs are the most complete photo album imaginable. But like most photo albums, they lie dormant except on special occasions. Just having the information stored there is one thing, but then in the story, there comes this new thing, this new search tool called Remem. And so Remem can search through your LifeLog and instantly pull up images and videos relevant to your query. And so this short story is told from two perspectives. And the one that I want to focus on is the perspective of a journalist writing a piece about this new search tool, Remem. As the journalist notes, he's long appreciated the usefulness of LifeLog technology for, determining the facts of the matter, like in legal proceedings. But he's much more skeptical about its use in our private lives. As he notes, when lifelogging first became popular, there were couples who thought they could use it to settle arguments over who had actually said what, using the video record to prove they were right. But finding the right clip of video wasn't easy. And all but the most determined gave up on doing so. The inconvenience acted as a barrier, limiting the searching of LifeLogs to those situations in which effort was warranted, namely situations in which justice was the motivating factor. Now Remem, this search tool, of course, changes things, because now with Remem, it's really easy to find just that right moment. And as the perspective author notes, when the only persons affected have a personal relationship with each other priorities are often more important, and a forensic pursuit of truth could be harmful. Did it really matter whose idea it was to take a vacation that turned out so disastrously? Did you need to know which partner was more forgetful about completing errands the other person requested? And so as the story goes on to explore, so much of who we are comes down to our interpretation of the events. And part of our interpretation is what we remember about those events and what we forget about them. And so forgetting is this kind of thing that helps ease our lives with one another, whereas a kind of perfect recall often stands in the way of that. And so we see forgetting facilitating this really valuable good that we see in both the origins of the juvenile court system and in our practices of forgiveness. Sometimes we have to just let go of the past. And so then the third and final example that I'm going to be presenting is the right to privacy. And so another thing that forgetting helps facilitate is our right to privacy. And so let me start by saying some things about the right to privacy, what it entails and when it's violated, just to get some intuitions going. So we have really strong intuitions about when someone's right to privacy has been violated. So for example, take the paradigmatic example of a burglar like breaking into your house. Your privacy has clearly been violated. Your home is your refuge. Someone has intruded on your space. But now imagine they do more than just like break in. They start like looking around. They look in your fridge and they see your leftovers. They open your underwear drawer and like make judgments about where you shop. They look at the notes that are like on your desk and see the paper that you've been drafting. Like there's something about their like looking around in this way that makes it feel way worse than if they had just like broken in and taken your TV. They broke in, took your TV, and they also looked at all your private things. Like that further thing about attending to like these private things about us is what makes that rights violation seem indisputable. And the wrongness of this like additional looking around, prying, or snooping suggests that there are processes of like coming to know things about others that can constitute a violation of their privacy. And we have a right against people coming to know things about us in those particular ways. So what the like snooping burglar violates is something called our contextual integrity. That's our ability to control, shape, and maintain our identity and how we present ourselves to others. And so contextual integrity is this concept introduced by Helen Nissenbaum to explain the importance of the control we exercise over how we present ourselves to different people in different contexts, something that the burglar violates. So as Nissenbaum explains, norms of appropriateness dictate what information about persons is appropriate or fitting to reveal in a particular context. Generally, these norms circumscribe the type or nature of information about various individuals that within a given context is allowable, expected, or even demanded to be revealed. In medical contexts, it's appropriate to share details of a physical condition, or more specifically, the patient shares information about his or her physical condition with the physician, but not vice versa. Among friends, we pore over romantic entanglements. To the bank or our creditors, we reveal financial information. With our professors, we discuss our grades. At work, it's appropriate to discuss work-related goals and details of quality of performance, etc. In my introduction today, we were focused on just my professional achievements. You didn't hear anything about my personal life because that's not the sort of thing that's appropriate for this context. And so in this description of like contextual integrity, we see various forms of siloed forgetting. Like what we know about each other, what we attend to, how we act, varies from context to context, where something's appropriate in some contexts and totally inappropriate in others. And so when it comes to what we should remember and what we should forget, I think these concerns about privacy and contextual integrity enter into the picture. And so as an example of this idea, there are sort of this idea that there are proper and improper ways of coming to know things about each other. And consider the fact that in the US court system, even with all its various faults, it recognizes that there is some evidence that's inadmissible in court if it's fruit of the poisonous tree, that we should ignore evidence if it was gathered in a way that violated a defendant's right. So if the police like break into your home and find some evidence connecting you to a crime, they cannot use that evidence in court because they did not have proper permission to be in your house to find that evidence in the first place. And so this doctrine captures like this sort of intuitive idea that it matters not just like what evidence you have, but also how that evidence came to be in your possession. And so when it was evidence you had no right to, it seems like the kind of thing that you should forget. And so as we see in all these cases of our sort of practices of forgetting facilitates this practice of significant moral value, this practice of like identity construction and shaping. Now, of course, I want to grant that, look, this duty can be trumped by other considerations. It's a tentative duty. It's best thought of as something like a prima facie duty. And so to call it a prima facie duty is just to say it can be defeated by stronger reasons to do otherwise. Like I have a prima facie duty to like hold the door open for you. But if I like just broke my arm, like that seems like the kind of thing that can defeat that reason. And so I hope to have shown that at this point that some of the forms that forgetting can take and made a case for why it's important or desirable. And so now I'm going to turn to some challenges that the internet and big data, I don't know which one's the right one, raise for forgetting. So whenever I say a word with a lot of vowels in it, it's always a surprise to me how it's going to come out as well. And so the importance of forgetting has started to be recognized. So the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, has introduced this right to be forgotten to combat the internet's the threat of the internet's permanence to our practices of identity construction. And so although it can help protect part of what's valuable about forgetting, I think there are other aspects of the good of forgetting that still remain threatened. But let's start with some background on this right to be forgotten. So the right to be forgotten was enshrined in European law following the 2014 ruling in Google Spain versus AEPD and Mario Gonzalez. And so this case centered on two newspaper announcements about a foreclosure auction on his home. As his social security debts had been resolved, he asked for those articles about the foreclosure to be removed because anytime anyone searched for his name, those were the first results that came up. And that he owed debts in the past, now that he's paid them, it's no longer relevant. And so just like the cases of juvenile arrest records and forgiveness, he didn't want his present to be fined by his past. And so the court determined that the articles could remain up, but that Google should no longer index them. It had to remove the links to those articles. And so this has given rise to this right to be forgotten, where we can have some personal data on the internet erased, provided certain circumstances are met. And so the valuable good that Mario Gonzalez had lost and that GDPR sought to restore is his contextual integrity, which, if you recall, is this control that we exercise over how we present ourselves to different people in different contexts. So Google undermined his contextual integrity by removing his ability to present different aspects of himself to different people, because anyone could search his name and discover this thing about his past, this thing that he doesn't want to define his future. So just like juvenile arrest records following one into adulthood, his future has been constrained by what people will think of him on the basis of these search results. And now how we appear in search results matters. Google has come to have a kind of monopoly on how we get information. In the United States, 79.8% of all desktop searches originate from Google. In the UK, it's 84.2%. In India, with a population of 1.38 billion, 94.19% of all desktop searches originate with Google. And so Google has come to have this control over how we access information, in large part due to how good it's been as a search engine algorithm. It's gotten much worse over recent years, but it was really good for a really long time, and that's how it became the main way that we access stuff on the internet. And so the reason it became so successful, even though now it's becoming a bit more shit, is that Google's PageRank algorithm this was probably too nice a room to swear in. But so Google's PageRank algorithm was inspired by academic citations, where the number of citations a paper receives is taken as an indication of its importance. And so Larry Page and Sergey Brin extended this logic to hyperlinks on the web as a way of measuring the importance of web pages. And so the algorithm prioritized sources that were linked from other sources. And so as a result, the algorithm could allow Google to sort search results with well-established sources like the BBC, CNN, appearing much higher than random blogs. And so at the time, this distinguished Google from other search engines because Google searches could give a kind of order to the sheer amount of information that's on the web. And unlike its competitors, it could sort search results according to importance. And so the success of that algorithm, which now is being gained by search engine optimization and AI-written blogs and all of that sort of stuff, the success of it that made it synonymous with the process of searching itself, so lends a kind of default authority to the rankings that have been delivered. And Google still remains a kind of monolithic filter through which large populations have access to information. Now notice how things would be different if articles about Mario's home foreclosure were only available in print. But the articles would still in some way constrain his future and his ability to present himself as he wishes, but in a considerably smaller way. Because an article that's published in a local newspaper that's only available in print would kind of function as forgotten over time. The records may be kept at a library, but one would have to physically go to a library, request the records, and search through them by hand. Just certainly much more difficult than just searching on Google. And so to make matters worse for contextual integrity, Google will also push information to you that you hadn't intended to search for. If you were simply searching for Mario's email address, your top results would still include results about his home foreclosure and his social security debts. And so digitized information about us, archived on the internet, has far greater reach than ever before. And the sort of like combined permanence of the internet and the new reach of that information makes it much less likely to be forgotten, let alone to function as forgotten, and it threatens these sort of important practices of identity shaping. And so the right to be forgetting is an attempt to like build forgetting back into the structure of the internet, but it still doesn't stop the harms from occurring. Because the internet facilitates a collapse of contextual integrity that's way less common in like the physical world. And so on context collapse, here's how Karen Frost Arnold defines it. So context collapse is the blurring or merging of multiple contexts or audiences into one. Internet theorist Dana Boyd is often credited with first observing that context collapse is one of the key features of the internet by noting that the lack of spatial, social, and temporal boundaries make it difficult to maintain distinct social relations. Like Facebook users may intentionally collapse multiple contexts of social relations into one audience by sharing information with all their Facebook friends, which may include family members, close friends, acquaintances, and work colleagues. And so you can like, even like the Facebook example is a bit dated, but sort of more modern, like social media apps like TikTok, like the new Threads and all of that sort of stuff, they facilitate context collapse even worse because you can't even like sort things according to like the people you're following. Like everything's just there for everyone. And so related to context collapse is this notion of context collision, where what you thought you were sharing in one context, like an Instagram story restricted to just your friends that will disappear after 24 hours, well, someone takes a screenshot of it, posts it on Reddit, and now millions of people have seen it. And so this use of the internet where like what you share could like suddenly become public to everyone else makes any sort of reasonable expectation of privacy seem almost impossible. And so to illustrate the kind of like mental burden that accompanies these like more egregious forms of context collapse, consider the following quote that Sophia Noble presents from an interview conducted with an anonymous victim of the revenge porn website Is Anyone Up? So the victim writes, I was submitted to isanyoneup.com by my ex-boyfriend. I'm confronted by friends, families, and strangers that have seen me naked online every day. You may think it's funny, but I sometimes don't want to leave my house and go to the mall with my family because I fear somebody will come up to me while I'm with my mother and mention it. My sisters are ashamed to be related with me. They want to lie to their friends that they are my sisters. I'm a disgrace to my family. My self-worth has gone out the window, and I worry I may never get it back. This keeps me one step away from happiness every single day. I don't know what to do anymore. And so you imagine you like search someone's name, and the first result are these like leaked nude photos of them. Like presumably, it doesn't seem crazy to say that you should forget what you've seen. Like just scrolling through those pictures feels like a violation of their privacy. And of course, it's like an even worse violation when they then like download them and like save them somewhere. But just the scrolling kind of feels like that burglar like snooping. Like you didn't like break into the house, but that stuff is like being presented to you. Because that person whose pictures those are never intended for them to be on the internet for the world to see. And so they seem to have a right against it like being so easy for you to find those pictures. Now, of course, in an ideal world, it shouldn't matter for how you think of someone that you've like seen these pictures of them. But the reason that revenge porn is revenge is because leaked nude photographs do in fact affect people's opinion of other people. And so to make matters even worse, search engine algorithms are able to not only access and reveal information about us, but they also have the power to like construct and dictate intimate parts of our lives. So to bring up another television show, consider Janet Kim from the hit Canadian sitcom Kim's Convenience. So Janet's trying to make a website to showcase her photography, Janet Kim Photography. And she wishes that her parents had given her a more unique name so her website would appear higher in the search results. Because here you see a quick search for Janet Kim Photography, over 19 million results. Like, how is she going to stand out in that? And so where our revenge porn victim wants to disappear, but the internet makes that difficult, Janet wants to stand out, but the sheer volume of information on the internet also makes that incredibly difficult. And there's very little control that we as individuals can exercise with regard to how we're presented online. There's little control that we can exercise with regard to these like really important identity shaping practices. And now parents have started to notice this. Parents have started, like, maybe this is just like Silicon Valley parents and they haven't made it here yet, but Many parents have started to vet their children's name by Googling them to see what kind of search history will follow their child. What kind of history will they inherit just in virtue of the name that they're given when someone searches their name? And so what matters here is not just like how the information is curated, like what appears as the top result when searching for your name, but what also matters is the availability and permanence of that information online and how it undermines the goods that forgetting seeks to facilitate. And so what should we do? Well, until we can change the incentive structures that make it so appealing to companies to mine our private information and make it accessible, one place where we can exercise some control is in how we respond to that information we discover about other people. So we can update our norms governing how people come to know things about us, what they store in their memory about us, how it's stored, how accessible it is, in order to enable these sorts of valuable forms of forgetting that the internet threatens. And so what we need is a norm of the following kind that resembles that fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. That when we learn something about another due to an act that violated their privacy, unless there are countervailing concerns of greater moral weight, we're required to forget what we've learned. And so I think there is here this sort of prima facie duty to forget what we learn in ways that undermine another person's privacy. All right, so on to the last section, some worries. So there are at least two challenges that arise for what I've been arguing here. First, there's a challenge that arises for any account that says there's something we ought to do with our attitudes, or we ought to have particular attitudes of a certain kind. Because our attitudes are generally taken to be the paradigm instance of something not in our control. And so if we can't change our mind, then there's no sense in which you ought to change your mind in this way. And so if we don't have control over them, we certainly don't have responsibility over our attitudes. So try right now to force yourself to believe something. Force yourself to believe right now that there's a tap dancing pink elephant right next to me. I've tried to help you out by generating this image of a tap dancing pink elephant, but I'm not saying imagine an image of a tap dancing pink elephant. Imagine an actual tap dancing pink elephant right next to me right here. You can't do it. Now, even if I try to offer you money, I have some pounds I need to get rid of before I return to the US. I think I have 70 pounds or something. Now I'm offering you that. Can you believe that there's a tap dancing pink elephant right here? No, it seems like the wrong kind of reason for that belief, and it's also just not the sort of thing that's in our control. And so extending this to forgetting, we can get rid of the pink elephant. Oh no, it's still up there. So extending this to the case of forgetting, the challenge becomes a question of whether we have sufficient control over forgetting such that we could ever be obligated to forget. Certainly it would be better to forget that you've seen someone's leaked nude photos, but if you can't actually do that, then how can you be required to do that? And so in response, my very quick response is that although ought implies can is kind of philosophical orthodoxy, I think it obscures that our everyday practices speak really strongly against it. And so I think in the philosophical literature, it's becoming much more recognized that, I don't have direct control over my attitudes. I can choose to raise my arm and lower my arm. I can't choose right now to believe that the lights in this room are off. But I can go and find the light switch and turn the lights off, and now I can believe that the lights are off. We have a lot of indirect control over how we come to have our beliefs. And so if you're the kind of person who's a little bit epistemically lazy, you just look for one piece of evidence before settling your mind, we can criticize you and say you shouldn't believe that, because it's in your power to be less lazy. It's in your power to go and look for more evidence before settling beliefs so quickly. And we can recognize that being the kind of person that does more investigation before believing is a better way to be than the person who settles their mind too quickly. And then it's also the case that there's a lot of empirical evidence that's been coming out to suggest that forgetting isn't this totally passive thing that happens to us, that it can be directed, it can be this sort of process, and we can cultivate in ourselves different ways of forgetting. And there's also a growing body of work in neuroscience suggesting that maybe our brain is built to forget. It's actually good that we don't, I know this is a terrifying thought, that it's actually good that we can't remember everything because it makes us better able to sort of navigate our world. And if that's right, then we should seriously be thinking about whether there are better or worse ways for forgetting. And so although we can't believe at will and some beliefs sort of come to us unwillingly, we can guide how we believe. We can train ourselves to be less quick to believe. It's up to us when we end inquiry and settle on belief. And so I think although we can't forget at will, it is the case that if we don't tend to our memories, if we sort the important from the unimportant, then a lot of stuff can sort of be forgotten. And so we might have some responsibility for how we conduct those practices of forgetting. And so forgetting is this process, and there's some control we can exercise, albeit indirectly, on that process. Now, there is a harder challenge lurking here, which is that perhaps the fundamental interests that we aim to protect through a right to privacy are actually impossible given the world that we find ourselves in. A world in which our ability to forget is being eroded by companies whose whole purpose is to preserve a record of everything so those records can be sold to the highest bidder. And so the more information about us that's preserved, the more information the internet makes easily accessible about us, the more central these large caches of information play in our lives, the harder it will be to maintain any meaningful sense of forgetting. And so the real challenge to forgetting is not our own volitional abilities of what's in our control and what's not, but it's this combined publicity and permanence of the internet and the challenge that poses to our ability to forget. And this isn't an easy one to answer. It kind of requires thinking about how the world needs to fundamentally change to protect a right to be forgotten. And so we're at the end now, and so I just want to wrap up by saying that I've been trying to argue that forgetting is important. I've not obviously been able to address every aspect of forgetting, that's why there's a whole series, but I hope to have shown that forgetting is a really important part of our moral duties to others, because there are some parts of our identity that are meant to be siloed, that are meant to be impermanent. And I want to end by sort of reiterating just this last challenge, which is that because this challenge requires changing our processes for accessing information about people online. But we've changed in many ways. It's really common to Google someone before you meet them for the first time and not act surprised that they've done so, whereas it used to be the case, it would be kind of creepy that they Googled you. Now it's less so. Addressing this second challenge means fundamentally changing our relationship to search technology. It means changing the internet to make the internet able to forget. Because forgetting seems really important, and the world is sort of standing in the way of it. Now, as for this really hard question of well, then how do we change the world? I don't know. But I hope to have shown you that we stand to lose something incredibly valuable unless things do change. And maybe we're okay with losing this thing because of other goods that we get, but I'm not yet convinced that we should lose this thing. And that's it. Thank you.
I wanted to ask about some interpersonal cases. You began with the interpersonal cases before moving on to the effects of technology. And you gave the example with you and your parents, and the underlying thought may be that sometimes when there's a narrative or a way of understanding someone's identity that they want to project, others may have a duty to forget in order to facilitate that. And I could see that maybe that's true in some cases, but there seems to be a wide variety of other cases where maybe what's required isn't forgetting, but rather tact. Where, as it were, it's not that, as it were, one literally doesn't know the thing anymore, but rather one dances around it in a way that's kind of skillful, that doesn't embarrass the person. Because it strikes me that in all sorts of cases, if you genuinely do succeed in forgetting, then you may be likely to do something that actually just seems, tactless or embarrassing. Say if there's something that happened when someone was young and then you completely forget about it, and you make a reference to somebody suffering PTSD and you realize, oh my God, I'd forgotten that this person had suffered PTSD, then you may actually wrong someone in a different kind of way. It seems thoughtless that there was something that while painful, they wanted to set aside, but they didn't want you to literally forget it. They just didn't want you to embarrass them with respect to it.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because we tend to think there are ways, this point about tact, this point about how we reinterpret the stuff in the past, know that, that what, it was still part of who they were, that they did this thing. It's just an embarrassing thing that we don't bring up. And I think a lot of the stuff we do is of that category, but some stuff might be like much more morally important, much more like central to someone's identity, where it really is like wrong to like hold on to that. And so I think like maybe cases of like dead naming would sort of be like this, where like you really, like that name, you don't even like hold on to it, like, because that would be like disrespectful to who this person is. It's just gone. Like that's just gone, because even if you hold on to it, then you risk maybe using that name. And really it should just like be completely siloed off and then eventually forgotten in these ways. And now I take like most cases of forgetting aren't like that. And it may be okay to like hold on to it, but just not attend to it. And so it's really like a norm of attention and not really a norm of forgetting. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. I wondered if you had any thoughts on sort of how we can decide what's good forgetting and whether that's just a subjective thing. So is it how much control really should individuals have over their contextual identities? So if someone wants you to forget something about them, is that sort of sufficient? Could it ever be that you should forget something even though someone doesn't want you to?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, and it's like, I'm going to give you a very annoying answer. So I should say, like, as a little bit of autobiography, like, I got interested in philosophy, I got interested in ethics because I wanted to know how to live. Like, I wanted to know what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do. And it turns out that's not what we do. It turns out actually giving like normative prescriptions of exactly what to do in each context, aside from like saying just to do the right thing, is very rarely anything sort of more concrete that's sort of said in that particular instance. And so I myself lean towards like a kind of like virtue approach of like trying, like part of like being a good person is developing like the wisdom to sort of know what to do in these sorts of situations where, like, returning to the first question, like sometimes you're going to make mistakes and you need to like own up to the fact that you made the mistake, but you made the mistake with the intention of like not making that mistake in the future. And so like when we should forget, when we shouldn't forget, it's going to vary a lot from sort of context to context. And sort of trying to like write down, like try to like enumerate exactly when that will happen is likely a failing task. But we can keep in mind like certain like virtues or goods that we want like to protect. And often it might be the case that you might just need to have a conversation with someone about, like, I know, like with the PTSD case, like I know this thing happened to you. How do you want me to think about that? And then it just becomes a matter of like respecting the person's wishes about how you hold that in your mind.
Thanks for the talk. The contextual identity and the stories we were told, they unfold at the scale of the individual. So we had Clementine and Lilia, private stories of private singular individuals or entities. And then I was starting to think, all right, so maybe a private person can claim that good of the contextual identity, but what if that person is also, say, a politician? And we care about accountability, and suddenly you engage in different relation to what is owed to you in terms of forgetting or not forgetting. And then I jumped from maybe an entity like a political person to a nation. If there is something like a claim to reconstruct the narrative that goes beyond the individual.
Yeah, these are all such brilliant questions. So like so we'll start with like the being in the public eye. Where being in the public eye, you give up certain rights to contextual integrity in virtue of like being a politician, in virtue of being a celebrity, in virtue of like being a spokesperson, like in virtue of like being a professor. I'm like expected to like conduct myself in certain ways that I wouldn't be expected to conduct myself if I wasn't like playing this role. And sometimes like taking on certain roles requires giving up that kind of privacy. And so the idea that you could like demand like the same kind of privacy as a politician as you could demand as a private individual, I think is a wild idea, given that you've been invested in this power and privileges that other ordinary people don't have. And so you have to give something up for taking on that role. And so I don't think they can like claim like they're like certain like, yes, like hacking someone's phones, like get their messages. that's not okay. But how they conduct themselves in public and they get seen behaving in this way, like they can't demand privacy in the way that, when I'm walking through campus on a Sunday morning and I see who happens to be walking between the dorms, returning to like their dorm from like another dorm, I'm not paying attention. Like who they sleep with is their own business. But then politicians, it starts to become other people's business in this way. And then as for nations, there does seem to be something quite perverse in the way that like some countries want to say like, don't bring that up. Like that's like, it's embarrassing. We don't want to like talk about it. And there's, in a large part, it's because there's never been any proper like reckoning of the thing. And so countries that have like actually gone through any sort of like reconciliation or like reparation process might legitimately be able to say like, please stop bringing that up. Like we've like done the time in a way, whereas like other countries that still like want to deny like residential schools, want to deny slavery, want to deny like horrific like war crimes that they've committed, they don't get to do that. Like it can still be like, no, that is like part of your history that you need to like attend to. And so it's sort of like when you forgive someone, there's like stuff that goes on that you have to do as like actual penance, and countries that haven't done penance don't seem to have a leg to stand on with respect to don't bring that up.
You spoke about the moral duty to forget. And my question is about the moral duty to remember, and specifically how to remember. So a thought I had when you were discussing the eternal sunshine of the spotless mind is oftentimes when we break with someone, there's this, in a romantic context, there's this conventional wisdom that they were a jerk, they did all these bad things, sort of an assassination of their character. And I wondered, do you have any thoughts on, do we have a moral duty to remember them in a certain way, namely an accurate way, an objective way, a charitable way?
Yeah, I think I'm going to say the unpopular thing, which is that you shouldn't think of them as a jerk. Like, even if it's like instrumentally helpful to like interpret everything they did as like justifying the breakup and like painting them in like a worse light than they are, I think they're still a person who demands like certain like recognition and respect. And I think that's something that we likely do, but it's something that we probably shouldn't be doing. And a better person wouldn't have to like think of their ex in that sort of way.
Thank you very much. I thought that the latter half of your talk about the political aspects, if I can call it that, and data and so on, AI, digital, was really interesting. But the first half, when you were talking about the personal, it seemed to me that you perhaps were just ignoring the psychological aspects, that everything was conscious and cognitive and under control, and your waste bin or whatever it was, silo forgetting, was something one chose to put memories into, which challenges a whole, certainly my sort of understanding of psychological things without being too psychoanalytic. The whole theory that we're not actually in control of our memories or our thoughts, that our minds do something really complicated and sometimes hang on to things we don't want to and sometimes get rid of them. And the big things, quandary for me, the really big traumata can be writ big in our memories and we can't get rid of them. In PTSD, say, as you mentioned, or sometimes they actually get completely knocked out, so we don't remember them. And as you said, we wouldn't know then. Well, the theory, psychological theory, is we do know it because it changes people's lives. There is a trauma, the whole theory of trauma. I wonder what you think about it. Would be alternative to your, I think, exposition, that if we're massively traumatized as a child, we don't necessarily remember it all. But it certainly changes the way our lives go for the rest of our lives. So if you could say something a bit about that.
I can try to address that a little. I can't go into like a whole theory of trauma and memory, but it certainly is the case that I think there's sort of the thing about like memory is that it is still malleable. And so we have instances of like how easy it is like implant like fake memories into someone by presenting them with falsified evidence that as a child this thing happened to them, and now they like really believe that this thing happened to them when we know that it didn't happen to them. And so memory, I think, is a lot more in our control than is like usually sort of talked about. Like I don't think that it is, they're really, so yes, there is stuff that's unconscious, that's inaccessible, that could be affecting how we reason about things and how we act. But I think a lot of our mind is still accessible to us, and at least in our control insofar as we can like shape our practices that then get reflected in how we think about things and the beliefs we hold on to and the memories that we have. And so in general, so the thing that I'm most skeptical of is any claim that we have no control whatsoever with regard to our memory. I think we do have some control, and then the interesting question is just, do we have enough control for these claims about moral responsibility to apply, or is it still like not enough control for that stuff to apply?
Do you think as human beings, we don't want to forget partly because we were evolved to recognize patterns? That's what kept us safe through the millennia, I guess.
Yeah, that getting information about the world is like really important to our evolutionary survival. And if we were the kinds of beings that would just like immediately forget anything that we learned about the world, we'd be really, really bad at navigating the world. But I think there are like interesting models being developed showing that forgetting is actually also like really helpful for navigating the world in terms of like how we explore it. So like if you thought you knew everything about one area, then you have no reason to like go back to that area. But if you've like forgotten things, you'll go back and like learn new things about that. And so it could be evolutionarily beneficial in that way. And so I take it that's what like certain like neuroscientists are finding with regard to like we have like limited space up here. And so we need ways of prioritizing stuff that's more important than other stuff, which then means facilitating some forms of forgetting with regard to some things. And so like, yeah, memory is like really important for being able to, like if I just forgot that there were these things here and just like walk straight towards you, like that would be really bad. But we still need to make space for like new information, and then forgetting is gonna play a role there. And then as for like how that story gets told, like we'll ask the empirical scientists about that one.
I'm really interested in the guide to forgetting. Could you speak more on that? Like, what are some examples?
A guide to forgetting?
How do you forget? How do you try and forget?
Yeah, so often you just stop, so like with like the first example, you like tactfully stop like thinking of that thing. Now, of course, when you try to like not think about a thing, it makes it just really hard. Like it's there because you're like trying to not think about this thing that you're trying to not think about. But as you sort of like as you sort of deprioritize it in your sort of reasoning about the world, then it starts to sort of in that sort of like unimportant file can start to like fade with time. And so actually like sitting down and like, it's sort of like if you like try to be happy, it makes it really difficult to like actually be happy. And so you kind of have to take like indirect measures towards it. I think forgetting will often sort of be like that. And so there's sort of interesting research coming out about like how when you like forgive someone, it's not like maybe you like still have the memory of it, but what sort of changes is your affect towards it. And it's like when you were hurt by someone, like you still feel it fresh. And then with time, you start to feel it less fresh. Like it doesn't have that same effective like hold on you. And then it doesn't become recalled as quickly because it's lacking that sort of affect that you had associated with it. And so, yeah, that's about the most I feel confident just sort of just like saying right now without then like turning to exactly how the literature presents it. But mostly it's just that as you treat it as unimportant, as you don't attend to it, then it starts to like fade in these ways.
I was just wondering about situations where someone has forgotten something. They've never made the memory, for example, like they did something when they were drunk, but you were there, so you have the memory. It has real world effect what they did. And then what's the moral kind of outcome of what you do with that?
Well, it depends on what they did.
Yeah, but if they did something bad. They did something bad, but you're like, it might come back, it might not come back. Obviously, when you share information with someone, you can't get full consent from them. Like if you share a secret, you can't actually get them to fully consent to it either because they don't know what they're agreeing to learn either. I was just wondering about the issue there where you're reinstating a memory for someone, they have forgotten it, but you know it.
Yeah, and so like in terms of like trying to give like ethical advice about what to do, like one of the questions that when asked in that sort of situation, same with like sharing a secret or like revealing the truth to someone when they don't know it, is like, to what end are you doing this? Like, are you doing this because like it'll hurt them, because it'll make you feel good that you don't have to hold on to this and you can now like pass it on to this person? Like that's often what we do with secrets. Like we don't want to hold on to it. We want to like share the responsibility with someone else, and it seems improper to now like force them into like sharing responsibility for the secret with you. Now, of course, if it's like they did something really awful and it's like they need to be held accountable for it, like, yeah, they're your friends, but there are certain like moral goods that also trump friendship, where it's like, yeah, you should be loyal to your friend, but sometimes friends do things where you should no longer be loyal to them. And so a lot of it's going to depend on that sort of like context to it. Like, what's the purpose of like telling them, and like what's the nature of the thing as well.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just had a question on the moral duty, and you mentioned that we have this moral duty of forgetting and the importance of it, but I just wanted to know, so although we have this moral duty to forget certain things, to what degree is this our moral duty? And what makes this our moral duty when we are a third-party bystander of this particular memory? So I'm more so referring to like experience that we are trying to forget that belongs to someone else.
Yeah, so we know this thing that happened to someone else, and it didn't happen to us. And we're now wondering, like, what duty do we have towards the remembering or the forgetting of this thing? That's the question. Yeah, and so a large part of it's going to depend on, like, what that thing is. Like, a lot of us, I hope, weren't participants in certain human atrocities that have happened over time, but we still, like, owe a duty. Like, even if we have, like, no like relationship to the victims of those crimes, if we have a duty to them to like remember that thing, and it does seem wrong if we were to like forget this thing that had happened. But of course, like not all examples, like these large like worldwide events. Maybe an example like a friend like went through like a really bad like breakup, and you like know certain details about the breakup, but they've now sort of like moved on from it in a way. And so now what should you do about your memories of the breakup? And here again, and like as like a human being, it seems like really difficult to like not forget like what a jerk this person was, but maybe you owe it to your friend if they've moved on to also like put your memories in line with their memories. But then again, this is never ask an ethicist what you should do, because then you can then imagine another sort of case where like tact says like you should remember that thing but just not bring it up, or like bring it up in these other sorts of ways. And so until like the exact details of the case and everyone's relationship is like spelled out in all these ways, it's really hard to give just like a general piece of advice other than just do the right thing. Just when it comes to what you should forget, just forget what you should forget. Like, is that not an informative answer?
Thanks. Yeah, I was just wondering if during your research and all of this stuff, if you had looked into, for instance, dementia, where somebody's may forget the name of their partner but can remember, or and certainly may forget what they just had for dinner, but ask them what they were, doing when they were 10 years old. Ask them questions about their early childhood, and they come, like this. And whether those kind of levels of memory played any part in your research, and if they got any, if they did, if you got any insight into the value of and depth of certain types of memories.
Yeah, and so like Hilda Lindemann's book, Holding and Letting Go, the final chapters are all about sort of end-of-life care and the sort of practices of holding and letting go that we might engage with people as they sort of forget these like really important parts of like who they were because of dementia or Alzheimer's, and just like general sort of memory loss. Because we have all these sorts of like difficult like bioethics examples of like someone who's been vegetarian their entire life, but is now in a care home, and they see someone getting like a different meal from them, and they're like, oh, I want the meatballs. And then it's like, well, whose preferences should you be respecting here? Should you be respecting the fact that their whole life they've had this like really important moral commitment to vegetarianism, or should you be respecting the fact that it will make them very upset right now that they're not getting the same meal as everyone else? And these are like really difficult questions to answer, but this is like what we need to like figure out with regard to these practices of like holding people in their identities. And so like when I teach that Lindemann material in my agency and identity class, like this is what we spend like a large part of the semester sort of discussing, because especially as we think about like elderly parents and how they might change with time, and they like might become like resentful of us as we like try to hold them in these identities that they no longer recognize about themselves. But it's important that we do still remember them like as they were before the Alzheimer's, because that's a much bigger part of their life than like this last moment of their lives. Like surely we want to be remembered as we have lived our lives over like the course of them, rather than just like those last 5 years and maybe the people we become then. And so, yeah, returning to the question of like how we should hold other people, then it seems like maybe like in the best way, but what the best way is then difficult to determine.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So assuming one has full control in forgetting certain memories, what are the moral duties when you think about taking an action to forget? For example, in a breakup, you can tend to think of the partner as someone who's a jerk, or actually a nice person. Do you have a moral duty to choose one over the other? And if it's an outcome-based exercise you're doing, which is to forget the other person, to get over the painful memories, do you choose the immoral sequence of steps just so that it fits in with your goal?
Yeah, so the question seems to come down to like, can we do the wrong thing in the effort to do the right thing, where like doing wrong by them now will make it like instrumentally easier to then do the right thing by them later, as opposed to like trying to do the right thing now might make it difficult or even impossible to do the right thing later or something with time. And I'm going to want to say, like, we do just have this responsibility to hold other people well, to think the best of them. And unless there is sort of like overriding moral considerations about why you shouldn't think well of someone, then I do think you owe it to them, even in the breakup, to still sort of think well of them. Well, yeah, well, that would be maybe one of the things that might be like an overriding sort of moral consideration, where like if you know that you cannot get to a stage where you can like healthily sort of think about this person unless you think about them in this way, then perhaps that could be a kind of moral consideration that overrides how you should treat them. We want to be really careful about anytime we invoke these sort of overriding moral considerations, because do you just think that now because you're sort of in this moment, and so it's like a sort of like selfish concern? Or is it like actually the case that you have to do it this way, otherwise you won't get this other good?
So I think just back on the back of that question,
I feel like there's been a lot of bad relationships so far.
I wanted to ask, like, so you said, to forgive is to forget. But, like sometimes there's a piece where there are conversations or difficult conversations that need to be had before you have that closure, before you can forget. But then there's also the different perspectives, right? So maybe that person in your life does not, like,
they've already forgotten. So in terms of my duty to forget, should I be bringing that back up for them?
If they've already moved on.
Yeah, if they've already moved on, or should I build that muscle to put it into my archive box, just like in my own mind?
Yeah, I'm tempted to lean towards the muscle route, in large part because I want to go back to like a thing that I said earlier, where like it matters like why are you bringing this back up for them? Like, are you bringing it back up because like you're still hurting about it and you're upset that they're no longer hurting about it, and maybe it would like help you to get over it if you saw them hurt some more, but like they maybe like got over it like too quickly in your view, and then that seems like you are just like using this person as like a mere means in a way that seems like kind of morally objectionable, unless there is some other like moral overriding purpose for it, where it is like it's genuinely the kind of thing that a good person shouldn't be able to like forget so easily, and so maybe they do need to be prompted about it again. But then you better be pretty confident that you're getting the right moral judgment there. Thank you all for coming.